Nobody expected it to be him. When the white smoke rose above the Sistine Chapel on May 8, 2025, the world held its breath. Cardinals had been locked in conclave for 2 days. 4 ballots had been cast. And the man who walked out onto that balcony to greet 1.4 billion Catholics, the man who opened his arms and said, "Peace be with all of you," was a boy from Chicago who once told a friend, by text message, that he was certain he could never be elected. His name was Robert Francis Prevost, and what God had planned for him, from the streets of a Midwestern city to the throne of St. Peter, is one of the most unexpected journeys in the 2,000-year history of the Church. Think about that for a moment. 2,000 years, 267 popes, and not once, not a single time, had the Church ever chosen a man born in the United States of America, until now. But this is not just a story about firsts. It is a story about a man who spent his entire life preparing for something he never knew was coming. A man shaped by decades of quiet, humble service, as a friar, a teacher, a missionary, a bishop, a shepherd. A man who chose, of all things, to spend his best years not in the corridors of power, but in the red dust of Peru, walking alongside the poor. God does not call the prepared. He prepares the called, and Robert Prevost's life, from beginning to end, reads like a slow and patient preparation for this moment. If this story moves you, stay with it. There is so much more to discover. Robert Francis Prevost was born on September 14, 1955, in Chicago, Illinois. His family was of French, Italian, and Spanish descent, a quiet legacy of different worlds woven together. He grew up in a city that in those years was enormous, restless, and deeply Catholic. Parishes on every corner, church bells on Sunday mornings, the smell of candle wax and old wood. He was a serious boy, good at mathematics, thoughtful in a way that made him seem older than he was. His faith was not something he wore loudly. It was something he lived quietly, the way you live the air you breathe. When he was a teenager, his path was shaped by a formative encounter with the Order of St. Augustine, the Augustinians. This is one of the oldest religious orders in the Church, founded in the 13th century, heir to the spiritual tradition of St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most penetrating theological minds Christianity has ever known. Augustine, the man who wrote, "Our heart is restless until it rests in thee." That restlessness, that searching, would mark Robert Prevost for life. He studied at an Augustinian minor seminary in Michigan. Then, in 1977, he graduated from Villanova University in Pennsylvania with a degree in mathematics. A mathematician, a man trained to see patterns, to follow a logic to its conclusion, to trust that order underlies chaos. That training would serve him well. In 1977, he entered the Augustinian novitiate in St. Louis. He professed his first vows in 1978, his solemn vows in 1981, and in June of 1982, he was ordained a priest, not in a grand cathedral, but as a member of an order that had taken a vow of communal poverty, a vow of service, a vow of obedience to something larger than himself. Have you ever made a promise you knew would cost you everything, and kept it anyway? That is what ordination means. It is not a ceremony. It is a surrender. After his ordination, Prevost went to Rome to study canon law at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Angelicum. He was brilliant, focused, systematic. In 1984, he earned his licentiate. In 1987, his doctorate. But even as he mastered the legal architecture of the Church, something else was pulling at him. Something that had nothing to do with libraries or lecture halls. The mission field. In 1985, Robert Prevost was sent to Peru, specifically to the remote mission of Chulucanas in the northern region of Piura. Dry land, poor land, land that had very little of what the world calls valuable, and very much of what God calls precious. He was there for a year. Then he returned to the United States briefly, working in his home province. But Peru did not release him. In 1988, he went back, this time to Trujillo, a city on the Pacific coast, where he would spend the next decade. A decade. 10 years. He served as prior of the Augustinian community there, from 1988 to 1992. He directed the formation of new Augustinian friars. From 1988 to 1998, he taught canon law, patristic theology, and moral theology at the major seminary of San Carlos y San Marcelo. He was the judicial vicar of the Archdiocese of Trujillo for 9 years. He was not a man passing through Peru. He was a man who had made Peru part of himself. As St. Paul wrote to the Philippians, "I have learned, in whatever state I am, to be content." That contentment, not resignation, but a deep peace with where God has placed you, is one of the things that would define Robert Prevost for the rest of his life. The people of Peru would know him not as a professor or an official, but as someone who walked with them, who sat at their tables, who prayed with them in their small churches, under corrugated roofs, in communities the world would never photograph for its magazines. If this story is touching something in your heart today, leave a comment below. I would love to know what the Lord is speaking to you through this journey. In 1998, he returned to the United States once more. He was elected prior provincial of the Augustinian province of Our Mother of Good Counsel in Chicago in 1999. And then, in 2001, something extraordinary happened. The Augustinian order elected him as their prior general, the supreme authority overseeing the entire worldwide order of St. Augustine. He was 45 years old. He would serve as prior general for 12 years, from 2001 to 2013, re-elected in 2007. 12 years governing a global religious family spread across dozens of countries, navigating tensions between tradition and renewal, between the needs of ancient communities and the challenges of a rapidly changing world. He traveled constantly. He listened carefully. He led by presence, not by edict. The Augustinian charism, friendship in the Lord, communal life, the restless search for truth, shaped his style of governance. He did not impose. He accompanied. In October 2013, Robert Prevost returned to his roots in Chicago. For a year, he served in formation, as provincial vicar, as a man stepping back into the ordinary rhythms of his community. But Pope Francis had other plans. On November 3, 2014, Pope Francis appointed him apostolic administrator of the Diocese of Chiclayo in Peru, the same northern region where he had first set foot nearly 3 decades earlier. He was simultaneously named titular Bishop of Sufar, and on December 12, 2014, the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, he was ordained a bishop. His episcopal motto, "In illo uno unum," in the one, we are one. Words taken from St. Augustine's commentary on Psalm 127, the idea that though we are many, in Christ we are a single body, a single people, a single hope. He entered the Diocese of Chiclayo not as a stranger, but as someone who had already given his life to this land. On September 26, 2015, Pope Francis formally appointed him Bishop of Chiclayo. He would serve there for 8 years, listening, building, healing, governing a local church with the same patient care he had always shown. In 2018, he became second vice president of the Peruvian Episcopal Conference. He served on the Economic Council. He chaired the Commission for Culture and Education. He was not a bishop who sat behind a desk. He was a bishop who knew the names of his priests, who visited the barrios at the edges of his diocese, who took seriously the word shepherd. Subscribe to keep discovering together the stories God left written for us. Stories like this one, that remind us that holiness often hides in the most unexpected places. In 2019 and 2020, Pope Francis appointed him to several Vatican bodies, the Congregation for the Clergy, the Congregation for Bishops, and in April 2020, in the middle of a global pandemic, he was also named Apostolic Administrator of the Diocese of Chiclayo, an additional responsibility that he carried for more than a year. He was not someone who sought the spotlight, but the spotlight, it seems, kept finding him. On January 30th, 2023, everything changed again. Pope Francis called him to Rome. He was appointed prefect of the dicastery for bishops, one of the most influential positions in the Roman Curia. The dicastery for bishops is responsible for selecting, evaluating, and appointing bishops all over the world. It is, in many ways, the engine room of the universal church. Whoever holds that position shapes the episcopate for decades to come. He was also named president of the Pontifical Commission for Latin America and granted the title of Archbishop. And on September 30th, 2023, Pope Francis elevated him to the College of Cardinals. He received the diaconate of St. Monica, the patron church of the woman who prayed her son Augustine into the faith. There is a beauty in that detail that is hard to ignore. A man formed by Augustine, a man given the church of Augustine's mother. These are not coincidences. These are the fingerprints of providence. As a cardinal, Robert Prevost participated in both sessions of the Synod on synodality. He accompanied Pope Francis on apostolic journeys. He was present in the rooms where decisions were made, listening more than speaking, watching, discerning. Those who worked with him described him as calm, measured, deeply spiritual. Not a politician, not a career climber, a servant. And then on April 21st, 2025, Pope Francis died. The Church entered a period of mourning, and then preparation. The conclave, the ancient solemn process by which cardinals elect a new pope, was set to begin on May 7th. The Vatican insiders debated the usual papabili, the favorites, the frontrunners, the men whose names had been whispered in corridors for years. Robert Prevost was not at the top of their lists. He was considered a dark horse, an ally of Francis, yes, a capable and spiritual man, certainly. But American, the United States, the world's only superpower? Could the Church really choose a pope from there? Prevost himself had his doubts. "I'm an American," he texted a friend. "I can't be elected." The Holy Spirit, it seems, had not consulted the pundits. The conclave opened on May 7, 2025. The cardinals entered the Sistine Chapel beneath Michelangelo's ceiling, beneath the image of God reaching out toward Adam, that eternal almost touch between heaven and earth. They voted. No result. Black smoke. They voted again. Black smoke. A third ballot. Black smoke. And on the fourth ballot, on the second day, it happened. An absolute majority. A name. A decision that 2,000 years of history had never before made. White smoke. At 6:07 in the evening, Roman time, the smoke rose above the Sistine Chapel, and the crowd in St. Peter's Square erupted. They did not yet know who had been chosen, but they knew. A pope had been elected. Robert Francis Prevost had been asked, in that most sacred and terrifying moment, whether he accepted his election as Supreme Pontiff. He accepted. He chose his name, Leo XIV. The name was not chosen casually. It was chosen with the full weight of history behind it. Pope Leo XIV, who reigned from 1878 to 1903, had written Rerum Novarum, the foundational document of modern Catholic social teaching. In an age of industrialization, of workers exploited in mines and factories, of old certainties crumbling, Leo XIII had proclaimed the dignity of the human person and the rights of labor. He had brought the Church into conversation with the modern world. Robert Prevost saw in 2025 a moment of parallel urgency, artificial intelligence, digital transformation, the disruption of work, of truth, of human relationship itself. In illo uno unum. In the one, we are one. He would speak that truth into a fractured world. Leo XIV, he said, stepping out onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, the whole square silent in that strange suspended second before joy breaks open. Peace be with all of you. The crowd roared. In the days and months that followed, Leo XIV moved with the same quiet purposefulness that had marked his entire life. On May 9th, he celebrated his first Mass as Pope in the Sistine Chapel. He spoke of a church that must be a beacon that illuminates the dark nights of this world, not a fortress, a lighthouse. His inauguration Mass was held on May 18th in St. Peter's Square. He received the pallium and the ring of the fisherman. The church, battered by years of crisis and controversy, had a new shepherd. He visited Turkey and Lebanon in late November 2025, his first apostolic journey. In Istanbul, he met with Patriarch Bartholomew of the Eastern Orthodox Church to commemorate the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea, the first great council of the Church, the moment when the early believers gathered to define what they believed about Jesus Christ. Leo XIV stood in that symbolic space as a man committed to Christian unity, to the healing of ancient wounds. On September 7, 2025, he presided over the canonization of Carlo Acutis and Pier Giorgio Frassati, two young men whose holiness had blazed through the 20th century like comets. He was telling the world something. Holiness is not the property of a distant past. It is alive. It is possible. It is here. In November 2025, he signed an amendment allowing women to become president of the Pontifical Commission for the Vatican City State, removing a requirement that restricted the role to cardinals. The doors of service in the Church, he was saying, are wider than we sometimes imagine. And on May 15, 2026, the anniversary of the publication of Rerum Novarum, he signed his first encyclical, Magnifica Humanitas, Magnificent Humanity. The document offered moral guidance on the use of artificial intelligence, calling the Church and the world to protect the dignity of human labor in the face of digital disruption. He compared the invisible labor that fuels AI infrastructure to forms of modern servitude. He issued a historic apology for the Church's role in slavery. He called for the rights of workers to be protected. He signed it on the anniversary of Leo III's great social encyclical. He was completing a conversation that had begun 135 years earlier. The baton passed across the centuries, from one Leo to another. Present at the Vatican when the encyclical was unveiled was Chris Olah, co-founder of Anthropic, one of the leading artificial intelligence companies in the world. He pledged to work with the Vatican on providing a moral foundation for the future of AI, the Church and the laboratory in conversation, the ancient and the new, seeking each other out, in illo uno unum. Today, as you watch this, Leo XIV is still writing his story. He is still making his apostolic journeys, still appointing bishops, still speaking words of peace into a world that is too full of noise and too empty of rest. He is a man shaped by Augustine's restlessness and Augustine's resolution. A man who learned mathematics but found his calling in mystery. A man who could have pursued power and chose instead to pursue the poor of Peru. A man who told a friend he could not be elected, and then walked onto the balcony of St. Peter's and said peace to the world. There is a verse in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verse 27, that says, God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. Not because weakness is God's preference, but because God works through surrender, through openness, through the willingness to say, not my will, but yours. Robert Francis Prevost spent 70 years learning to say those words, and when the moment came, he meant them. Today, before you close this video, take a moment. Think of the place in your life where you have been telling yourself, I can't be the one. I'm not ready. God wouldn't call me. Tell God what you've been carrying. Because this story is not only about one man. It is about what happens when a human being trusts, quietly and completely, that they are not alone. And if you think this story is something, wait until you discover the story of the man Leo XIV chose as his spiritual model. The story of a North African bishop who spent his whole life searching for truth, who sinned magnificently and repented even more magnificently, and whose words have comforted believers for 1600 years. The story of Augustine of Hippo. That one is next. God does not always call the expected. He calls the faithful. And Robert Francis Prevost, the boy from Chicago, the friar of Peru, the 267th successor to St. Peter, was faithful all the way to the balcony.